Although they don't get a lot of play these days, the 2D beat-em-up was a staple of the 1980s and 90s. Games like Double Dragon, Golden Axe, and River City Ransom helped turn the admittedly simple genre into a system seller. But when it came to 16-bit brawlers, there were only two names that mattered: Final Fight and Streets of Rage. Today we're going to be taking a look at what magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly, Die Hard Game Fan, Mega Play, and Computers and Video Games said at the time, and then we're going to crunch the numbers, deciding once and for all which classic beat-em-up is king. Before Street Fighter II changed everything, Final Fight was the biggest brawler in the arcades. So when Capcom announced that their coin-op hit would be headed to the Super NES, critics and fans assumed it would be yet another major coup for Nintendo. But that was before a string of troubling cuts and changes were announced, all of which hushed the excitement. Fans were understandably disappointed to learn that the game's beloved two-player mode had been axed, along with some of the levels and enemies. If that wasn't enough, the three-person roster was trimmed down to just two, removing one of the best characters in the game. It was a giant letdown for anybody with fond memories of the arcade original, and critics noticed. "I'm disappointed," barked Sushi X, Electronic Gaming Monthly's resident fighting game fan. "When I first turned Final Fight on, I thought, cool, it's the best. Then I found out that Guy, my favorite character in the arcade, was missing. The final nail in the casket was the lack of two-player simultaneous play. Bad move." Superplay agreed that Final Fight was lacking the spark without the two-player mode, going as far as to note that even rival turfs offered a co-op mode. Harsh. On the other hand, GamePro was a lot more forgiving, giving it a perfect 5 out of 5 and not letting the missing content get them down. A few more levels would have been nice too, but hey, we can't have everything. Computers and Video Games agreed, giving it a 92% and raving that Final Fight is simply the greatest beat-em-up available on any console or computer, and it's simply an essential purchase. If ever there was a Final Fight killer, it was Streets of Rage. Sega's 1991 beat-em-up seemingly came out of nowhere and left an immediate impact. It was larger, had more characters, featured a larger move list, and, best of all, offered two-player support. Plus, it had the benefit of being brand new, not a rehash of an arcade game we've beaten countless times. It was everything Final Fight wasn't, and critics couldn't get enough. The Mega Drive has been screaming for a truly brilliant beat-em-up for years, explains Computers and Video Games, and now Streets of Rage knocks the competition into a cocked hat. Although they didn't use the same slang, this was a sentiment repeated throughout the reviews, with GamePro giving it a perfect 5 out of 5, Sega Pro offering up a 96%, and Megatech coming in with 92%. Giving it all 9s, the EGM crew couldn't stop gushing over Sega's accomplishment. Streets of Rage blows away all other home fighting games with superb graphics, terrific interaction, and more forms of attack than you can imagine. Mega Play also chimed in, saying the last thing Capcom wanted to hear. At first, I thought Final Fight would be unstoppable, but Streets of Rage is mind-blowing. The advantage goes to Streets of Rage, which ended up averaging a score of 91% from 15 different reviews. In contrast, Final Fight only averaged an 80% from 13 critics. Well, that's certainly respectable. Many expected that it would be a standout game in the Super Nintendo's launch window. Instead of being a must-own arcade port, Final Fight was outplayed by the new kid on the block. Let's see if Capcom can reverse their fortunes in round 2. Seeing the criticism surrounding Final Fight, Capcom decided to go back to the drawing board and deliver a brand new sequel with more levels, new characters, and the all-important two-player mode. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to satisfy critics, who weren't ready to embrace 2D beat-em-ups in a post-Street Fighter II world. Final Fight 2 is a fighter to be reckoned with, but it's not a knockout, explains GamePro. You'll want to take it on for the thrills of two-player final fighting, but the gameplay's predictable, the music's weak, and the enemies are bums. Die Hard Game Fan agreed, concluding, Unfortunately, the only advantage Final Fight 2 has over the original Super NES is the two-player action. Everything else is more of the same. Things were even more dire at SNES Force, a Nintendo magazine system. Both publications gave the game a 58%, harping on the simplicity. The backgrounds are okay, with one or two nice touches, but the sprites are a tad shoddy and can suffer from horror of horrors, screen flicker. Even with the new characters and two-player support, critics were not impressed with Final Fight 2. It was a completely different story over on the Genesis. Having shocked everybody with the original Streets of Rage, Sega was ready to unleash an even bigger adventure with better graphics and more characters. It not only improved on the original in every way, but it made Final Fight 2 look obsolete months ahead of release. Critics couldn't wait to swoon over Streets of Rage 2, with GamePro leading the charge. Stacked against the Final Fights and Super Double Dragons of the world, Streets of Rage 2 more than fends for itself. Mean Machine Sega agreed, calling it better than Neo Geo. Streets of Rage 2 is a truly classic arcade beat-em-up from Sega. And when I mean arcade quality, I mean a game that actually beats the spots off of any Neo Geo beat-em-up. After gushing over the original, Megaplay wasn't as enthusiastic about Streets of Rage 2. Howard Grossman called it a solid action fighter with a good variety of moves and weapons. However, he complained that the special moves made the game too easy. Martin Alessi echoed those thoughts, calling it a solid cart and griping about the simple and repetitive gameplay. Megaplay was the exception, with all other critics giving the game either a 90% or higher. Things went from bad to worse for Final Fight in Round 2. After the original averaged a so-so 80%, the sequel plummeted to a less than ideal 71%. Streets of Rage 2, on the other hand, is sitting at 90%, down just 1 point from the original. The advantage once again goes to Sega's beat-em-up, but maybe Capcom can rally in the final round. By 1995, Final Fight fatigue had set in, and the days of giving Hagar the benefit of the doubt were long gone. Gamers had completely moved on to one-on-one fighting games, and nobody had time for another half-assed sequel from Capcom. Alas, Capcom has once again disappointed me with a thoroughly mediocre Final Fight sequel, begins Nick Rocks of Die Hard Game Fan. Technically, Final Fight 3 seems worse than its predecessors. Extensive flickering and slowdown prevail. At 77%, Nick was the critic most generous to the unnecessary sequel. On the flip side, Next Generation gave the game 2 stars out of 5, by far the worst score of the bunch. They complained that this game is completely derivative, and technically it could just as easily be the first in the series as the latest. The Superplay wasn't ready to be as diplomatic as the rest. The challenge is a travesty. Many household pets could take up the rather pathetic gauntlet admirably. Capcom have become sloppy in their old age, and need a good slap. Only 4 years after the first game hit consoles, critics were finally ready to ditch Final Fight once and for all. Beat-em-up fatigue was not exclusive to Final Fight, as Sega found their third and final Streets of Rage game plagued with lower scores. Instead of the usual 9s, this sequel squeaked by with 7s and 8s. While that's certainly higher than Final Fight's lowest scores, the writing was clearly on the wall for 2D brawlers. Streets of Rage 3 is like an old friend, begins GamePro. An old friend who won't stop trying to kick your butt. Most magazines complain that you've seen it all before and there's not much new here. That's what Game Player said right before giving the brawler a 90%. Mean Machine Sega also had mixed thoughts, but ultimately concluded that Streets of Rage 3 wipes the floor with the previous two in terms of graphics and presentation. On the low end, Electronic Gaming Monthly's Al Manuel gave the game a 7 and complained about the slowdowns. That said, his review was surprisingly positive, to the point where I'm starting to doubt his 7. A similarly low score came from Die Hard Game Fan, who took issues with the localization changes that happened when the game came west. By the import, or pass altogether. It's a clean sweep, with Streets of Rage once again taking the round. Critics were not impressed with Final Fight 3 when it was released in 1995, scoring it an average of 56%. Streets of Rage also saw a significant dip, but nowhere near as steep as Final Fight. Streets of Rage 3 managed to score an average of 71%, tying it with Final Fight 2. When it comes to the franchise average, Streets of Rage once again takes it with 84% compared to Final Fight 69%. I think it's safe to say that if you're going to go through one 16-bit beat-em-up trilogy, it should be Streets of Rage. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these old reviews. I hope you're interested in seeing more of what these old school critics said, because I enjoy analyzing the scores. I'm hoping to do more of these franchise versus franchise features, so I'd love to hear your ideas on what I should tackle next. Also, if you want to know more about classic reviews, I recommend you check out our Nintendo Power Best and Worst playlist. We go year by year ranking the reviewed games, and I guarantee you won't see the scores coming. Anyway, you should go ahead and click the subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.